Decades after World War II ended, American veterans would sit in quiet rooms far from the battlefields of Europe and admit something that rarely made it into official histories. There was a moment in combat when courage didn't matter, training didn't matter, and even numbers didn't matter. It was the moment a certain sound tore through the air, a sound so fast, so unnatural, that men instinctively pressed their faces into the dirt, convinced that standing up meant instant death. Many assumed this fear came from massive German tanks rumbling toward them, steel monsters that symbolized Nazi power. But the truth, whispered in reunions and buried in memoirs, was far more unsettling. What if the weapon U.S. soldiers feared most wasn't a tank at all? What if it was something smaller, cheaper, and so brutally efficient that it reshaped the psychology of the battlefield itself? And what if the real reason behind that fear was quietly minimized after the war, because admitting it would challenge everything we think we know about how World War II was fought?
On September 1, 1939, as German forces crossed into Poland and ignited the most devastating conflict the world had ever known, military planners on both sides still believed wars would be decided by grand maneuvers, armored breakthroughs, and decisive clashes between massive formations. Tanks were expected to dominate the battlefield, aircraft to terrorize cities, and artillery to smash defenses from miles away. Yet hidden behind this grand vision of modern warfare was a quieter revolution taking place inside German factories and armories, one that would not announce itself with roaring engines and towering silhouettes, but with a sound that veterans would later describe as unforgettable and terrifying beyond reason. The German army, the Wehrmacht, entered the war with a doctrine that emphasized speed, coordination, and relentless pressure. Infantry units were expected to move quickly, exploit weaknesses, and hold ground against counterattacks, while armored units pushed forward. To make this possible, German planners believed infantry needed something more than rifles and slow-firing machine guns. They needed a weapon that could dominate open ground, suppress enemy movement instantly, and create a psychological barrier that opponents would hesitate to cross. This belief would soon give birth to a machine gun so effective that it became the backbone of German infantry tactics throughout the war. When American forces would later encounter this weapon in North Africa and Europe, many of them had never experienced anything like it. U.S. infantry doctrine at the time centered around the rifleman as the heart of the squad, supported by relatively slow but reliable automatic weapons. American soldiers were trained to advance, maneuver, and overwhelm enemy positions through coordinated movement and fire. But on the battlefield, doctrine often collapses under the weight of reality, and reality arrived in the form of a weapon that fired so rapidly it seemed less like individual shots and more like a single continuous tearing of the air. The first Americans to face this new German machine gun did not immediately know what it was. What they knew was the sound. Veterans later recalled that it did not resemble the deep, steady rhythm of earlier machine guns. Instead, it produced a high-speed, buzzing roar, as if fabric itself were being ripped apart at impossible speed. Some swore it sounded mechanical, unnatural, almost alive. Others compared it to a buzzsaw cutting through wood. And before they could identify the weapon, they felt its effects. Entire squads pinned down in seconds, men unable to lift their heads without bullets snapping inches overhead, attacks that stalled instantly, not because of visible defenses, but because of invisible death sweeping across open ground. This machine gun was not rare. That was part of its terror.
Tiger tanks were feared, yes, but they were also uncommon. Many American soldiers would fight for months without ever seeing one. But this weapon seemed to be everywhere, on hillsides, in forests, covering crossroads, guarding villages, and anchoring defensive lines. Wherever German infantry stood their ground, this machine gun was usually there, waiting. By the time U.S. forces landed in North Africa in late 1942, they were confident. America's industrial might was mobilizing at unprecedented speed. Equipment flowed across the Atlantic, and training emphasized adaptability and firepower. Yet during early engagements, American units found themselves halted again and again by German defensive positions that appeared modest at first glance. A handful of soldiers, a shallow trench, a few sandbags, and then the firing would begin. Within moments, advancing troops were forced flat against the earth, unable to move forward or back, as bullets stitched lines across the terrain with terrifying precision. What made this weapon so devastating was not just its rate of fire, but how it was used. German infantry doctrine revolved around the machine gun as the centerpiece of the squad. Everything else existed to support it. Riflemen carried ammunition, protected flanks, and maneuvered to keep the gun firing as long as possible. Crews were trained to change barrels quickly, allowing sustained fire that seemed endless to those on the receiving end. To American soldiers, it felt as if the gun never needed to pause, never needed to breathe. Psychologically, the impact was enormous. Veterans later admitted that once the sound began, time seemed to slow. Decisions became harder. Courage wavered. Men hugged the ground, not because they lacked bravery, but because instinct screamed that moving meant dying. Officers found it difficult to motivate advances when every attempt was met with a wall of fire that erased the space between safety and death. Even artillery support did not always silence these guns immediately, and the moment firing resumed, the paralysis returned. As the war progressed and American forces pushed deeper into Europe, they adapted. New tactics emerged, coordination with armor improved, air support became more precise. But even as the Allies gained the upper hand, the fear inspired by this weapon never fully disappeared. Soldiers learned to respect it, to plan around it, and to neutralize it before anything else. In countless after-action reports, references appeared again and again to machine gun nests that halted advances, delayed assaults, and inflicted disproportionate casualties. Yet after the war, popular memory gravitated toward tanks, aircraft, and dramatic battlefield moments. Massive steel giants like the Tiger tank captured the imagination. They were visible, iconic, and symbolic of German engineering. The machine gun, by contrast, was smaller, less cinematic, and harder to mythologize. Its true impact lived in the memories of infantrymen who had faced it firsthand, memories that spoke of fear, helplessness, and respect for a weapon that did exactly what it was designed to do. By the end of World War II, American forces had overcome this threat through adaptation, numbers, and overwhelming support. But the question remains, if this weapon was so effective, so feared, and so influential in shaping infantry combat, why did it fade into the background of popular history? Why did veterans insist they feared it more than tanks, while history books focused elsewhere? And what does that omission reveal about how wars are remembered and misremembered long after the shooting stops? As American forces pushed deeper into Europe in 1943 and 1944, the fear inspired by this German machine gun evolved from shock into grim expectation. Soldiers no longer asked if they would encounter it, but when. The sound that once came as a terrifying surprise now lingered in the back of their minds even during moments of quiet. Veterans later recalled that silence itself became suspicious because they knew how quickly it could be shattered by that familiar ripping noise. Entire units learned to read terrain differently, scanning hedgerows, stone walls, tree lines, and upper-story windows, not for tanks, but for the subtle signs that a machine gun crew might be waiting. The weapon's dominance was not accidental. German commanders understood that controlling space mattered more than raw numbers, and this machine gun allowed a small force to hold ground against a much larger enemy. Its rapid rate of fire created an illusion of overwhelming strength. American soldiers often believed they were facing multiple guns, when in reality it was sometimes only one well-positioned crew. This illusion shaped battlefield decisions, slowing advances and forcing U.S. commanders to commit additional men, artillery, or armor just to neutralize a single firing position. The gun did not need to kill every soldier in its path. Its true power lay in its ability to deny movement and control behavior. Nowhere was this more evident than in the hedgerow country of Normandy. After D-Day, American troops found themselves fighting in a landscape that favored defenders. Narrow fields bordered by thick earthen banks and dense vegetation created natural killing zones. German machine gun crews exploited this terrain with deadly efficiency, positioning themselves to fire along likely avenues of approach. The moment American infantry attempted to cross open ground, the air filled with that unmistakable sound. Bullets snapped overhead, struck the earth in violent bursts, and forced men to the ground before they fully understood what was happening.
Veterans described a unique kind of fear associated with this weapon. It was not the sudden terror of an explosion or the distant rumble of artillery. It was constant, pressing, and inescapable. The gun did not simply announce danger, it sustained it. Men could lie pinned down for minutes or even hours, afraid to move a muscle. Wounded soldiers sometimes cried out for help, but medics knew that standing up meant drawing immediate fire. In those moments, the machine gun dictated everything. Time, movement, and survival itself bent around its presence. American units adapted through hard-earned experience. New tactics emphasized flanking maneuvers, smoke cover, and coordinated assaults designed to overwhelm or outmaneuver machine gun positions. Small unit leadership became critical as junior officers and non-commissioned officers learned to make split-second decisions under intense pressure. But adaptation did not erase fear. Even seasoned soldiers admitted that hearing the gun open fire still sent a jolt through their bodies, a reminder that no amount of experience made them immune. The psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield. Letters home from soldiers rarely mentioned specific weapons, but when they did, descriptions of German machine guns stood out. Some referred to them as relentless, others as merciless. A few used darker humor, calling the sound the song you never forget. These accounts reveal a deeper truth about warfare that official reports often overlook. War is not only about firepower and strategy, it is about how weapons make people feel, how they shape decisions through fear as much as force. German soldiers, too, understood the value of this weapon. Diaries and post-war interviews reveal a quiet confidence in its effectiveness. Crews took pride in their ability to hold off superior numbers, and commanders relied on them to stabilize collapsing fronts. Even as Germany's strategic situation worsened and resources dwindled, machine gun crews remained a critical component of defensive operations. In many cases, they fought until ammunition ran out or positions were overrun, fully aware that surrender or retreat often meant death or capture.
As the Allies advanced toward Germany itself, the machine gun continued to exact a heavy toll. Urban combat presented new challenges, with firing positions hidden in rubble, basements, and upper floors. The sound echoed through ruined streets, amplifying its psychological effect. American soldiers learned that clearing a building or crossing an intersection without first silencing the gun was an invitation to disaster. Once again, the weapon dictated the pace of battle, forcing attackers to slow down, reassess, and commit resources. Despite its effectiveness, this machine gun rarely appeared in wartime propaganda or post-war celebrations. Tanks rolling through liberated cities made for powerful images. Aircraft formations symbolized industrial might and technological superiority. The machine gun, by contrast, was associated with grim, close-quarters fighting and invisible terror. It was a soldier's weapon, experienced intimately by those on the ground, but easily overlooked by those viewing the war from a distance. After the war, many American veterans struggled to explain why this weapon had frightened them so deeply. To outsiders, it was just a gun, but to those who had faced it, it represented moments of absolute helplessness, when survival depended on luck, timing, and the courage of comrades willing to risk everything to silence it. Some veterans admitted that they still heard the sound in their dreams years later, a reminder of how close death had come. Historians eventually began to acknowledge the machine gun's role in shaping infantry combat, but popular narratives continued to emphasize larger, more dramatic elements of the war. This imbalance raises an uncomfortable question. If one of the most feared weapons of the conflict was not a tank or a bomb, but a machine gun, what does that say about how wars are remembered? And more importantly, why was the full extent of its psychological impact rarely discussed in official histories? As World War II drew to a close and Germany collapsed, the weapon's legacy did not end on the battlefield. Its design influenced future generations of firearms, and its tactical philosophy reshaped infantry doctrine around the world. Yet the stories of fear, paralysis, and respect it inspired remained largely confined to veterans' memories. The truth lingered beneath the surface, waiting to be fully acknowledged. And still, one mystery remains unresolved. If this machine gun was so feared, so influential, and so central to the experience of American soldiers, why did military leaders after the war downplay its importance? What uncomfortable truths lay behind that silence? And what does that silence reveal about the realities of combat that nations prefer to forget? When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, American soldiers returned home carrying stories that often conflicted with the official narrative of victory. Parades celebrated tanks rolling across enemy territory, bombers darkening the skies, and generals accepting surrender documents. These images became the foundation of how World War II was remembered. Yet among the infantrymen who had crawled through mud, hedgerows, and shattered streets, a quieter truth lingered. Many of them knew that the most decisive moments of their war had not involved massive armored clashes, but sudden encounters with a weapon that froze entire units in place and forced life-or-death decisions within seconds. In the immediate aftermath of the war, U.S. military analysts began a thorough examination of German weapons and tactics. The goal was not nostalgia, but preparation. Another war was always possible, and lessons needed to be learned. When American engineers and ordnance officers studied the German machine gun that soldiers had come to fear so deeply, they were struck by its efficiency, simplicity, and battlefield impact. It was, by nearly every technical and tactical measure, superior to most Allied equivalents. Its rate of fire, ease of barrel change, and adaptability to different roles made it a weapon ahead of its time. And that was precisely the problem. Publicly acknowledging that American soldiers had feared a German machine gun more than Germany's most famous tanks created an uncomfortable narrative. World War II had been framed as a triumph of American industry, training, and doctrine. Admitting that a relatively small, portable weapon had consistently disrupted U.S. advances challenged the idea that technological superiority alone guaranteed dominance. It suggested that American infantry doctrine had entered the war with blind spots, and that those blind spots had cost lives.
There was also a psychological dimension that military leaders were reluctant to emphasize. Fear is not easily quantified, and admitting how deeply it affected soldiers risked undermining the heroic image of the American fighting man that post-war society wanted to celebrate. Veterans were expected to come home as conquerors, not as men haunted by a sound they could never forget. So the stories remained personal, shared quietly between those who had been there, rarely elevated into the broader historical narrative. As decades passed, fragments of the truth began to surface. Oral histories, memoirs, and declassified reports painted a more complex picture of infantry combat in World War II. Again and again, references appeared to the same weapon, described in strikingly similar terms by men who had never met each other. The sound, the paralysis, the feeling that courage alone was useless in the face of it. Historians slowly began to connect the dots, realizing that this machine gun had not merely been a tool of war, but a psychological weapon that shaped behavior on the battlefield. Its influence extended far beyond Germany's defeat. Post-war military planners around the world studied its design closely. Entire families of modern machine guns trace their lineage directly back to it. The concept of the machine gun as the centerpiece of an infantry squad, rather than a supporting element, became standard practice in many armies. In this sense, the weapon achieved a legacy far greater than any single tank or aircraft. It permanently altered how infantry combat was fought. For American veterans, however, the legacy was more personal. Reunions often brought old memories to the surface, and conversations would drift back to moments when everything seemed lost because of that relentless fire. Some veterans admitted that they had feared crossing open ground more than facing armored vehicles. Tanks could be avoided, flanked, or destroyed with the right equipment, but the machine gun was always there, hidden, patient, and waiting. It punished hesitation and rewarded preparation, turning every movement into a calculated risk. Over time, historians began to reframe the narrative. Victory in World War II had not come easily or cleanly. It had been forged through adaptation, sacrifice, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. One of those truths was that American forces learned many of their most important lessons the hard way, under fire from an enemy who understood the power of infantry weapons better than anyone else at the time. And this brings us back to the mystery posed at the beginning of this story. Why did U.S. soldiers fear this weapon more than Tiger tanks? The answer is not found in armor thickness or battlefield spectacle, but in proximity. Tanks were terrifying, but they were distant, visible, and relatively rare. The machine gun was close. It was everywhere. It confronted soldiers at eye level, denying them movement, control, and sometimes hope. It did not announce itself with dramatic explosions. It simply began firing, and in that instant, the battlefield belonged to it. The final truth, long obscured by history's focus on grand machines and sweeping offensives, is this. The most feared weapon in World War II was not always the largest or the loudest. It was the one that controlled human behavior most effectively. The German machine gun earned its grim reputation not because it killed more men than tanks, but because it made men feel powerless in a way few other weapons could. That fear shaped tactics, slowed advances, and forced armies to evolve. And that is why, even decades later, veterans spoke of it in hushed tones, not as a symbol of defeat, but as a reminder of how fragile courage can be when faced with perfectly engineered terror. History may remember the tanks and bombers, but those who lived the war never forgot the sound that truly ruled the battlefield.